What's up y'all, Seth Richardson here, and today I'm going over my camera settings for filming my hunts. If you're using a camera that has manual settings, I highly recommend that you take that little dial and just turn it over to manual mode and try it out. Now I know that's a little bit scary at first, but with some practice it's going to come natural and you can get better results. So now that you've turned that dial over to the M, let's talk about frame rates. Now depending on what camera you have, you may have more or less options here. You may not have any options at all, and that's fine. But I'm going to show you the options that the GH5 has. As you know, that's what I am using if you've seen my other videos. So let's go over those now. If you're looking for that cinematic look, then everyone is going to tell you you must shoot at 24 frames per second. If you go watch a movie in a movie theater, that's what you're watching. For most of my hunts though, I'm using either 30 or 60 frames per second. The GH5 shoots 4K at 60 frames per second, and that's what I use most of the time when filming my hunts. This gives me more flexibility when editing. I'll then use a 30 frames per second timeline, and if I want to slow the footage down to half speed, it's now playing back at 30 frames per second with a nice slow motion. Or if I want to play at normal speed, the computer will just toss out every other frame since it's an even multiple. If it's early morning or late evening though, I'll use 30 frames per second because that allows me to use a lower shutter speed and the camera can take in more light. We'll talk more about that in a minute. If your camera shoots 4K, then I would take advantage of it. I always use 4K because if I export all my projects at 1080, which is full HD, this allows me to zoom in a little bit and to reframe my shots if things didn't go exactly as planned. And since animals move wherever and whenever they feel like, things usually need a little bit of reframing. Just be sure your computer can handle 4K and that you have plenty of storage space to save all that footage. If your camera only does 1080 though, no need to worry. It's not a big deal and there's no need to run out and buy a new camera. Don't worry too much about having the latest greatest camera. As soon as you buy one, they'll come out with another one. Now, I have a GH5 because I do videography on the side. Alright, let's talk about bitrate. Now, unless you have a cinema camera that shoots raw video, your video is going to be compressed, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Raw files are large and they take a lot of work to get ready for the final viewing product. So most cameras compress the footage so they're easier to work with, but not all compression is created equal. The bitrate lets us see how much compression we are dealing with. Now the GH5 has several options here, and I normally just use 150 megabits per second because that's what's available when I'm shooting 4K 60. But 100 megabits per second is also a good option. I find it to be a good trade-off between file size and quality. The GH5 offers 400 megabits per second, but that's 50 megabytes per second. So you can imagine how much space that takes up on SD cards and hard drives, and it really slows down the editing process also. So I recommend 100 megabits per second if your camera has that available. If it doesn't go that high, then just use whatever the highest possible value is. As promised, let's talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time the shutter stays open. For video that have the right amount of motion blur that feels natural for our eyes to look at, you want to use what we call the 180 degree rule, which is that your shutter speed should be twice that of your frame rate. So if I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, I want my shutter speed to be 1/60th of a second. If I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, I want my shutter speed to be 1/48th of a second, or 1/50th if your camera doesn't have 1/48th. Also, if I'm shooting at 60 frames per second, then I want my shutter speed to be 1/120th of a second. Now, if it's bright outside, your footage may be overexposed with these settings. So that brings us to aperture. Aperture is how wide the opening is letting light into your sensor. It's measured in what we call f-stops or t-stops if you're using a cinema lens. The lower the f-stop number, the wider the opening and the more light the camera is going to take in. So if your footage is overexposed, using a higher f-stop number will bring it down to a suitable level. It's also easier to focus with a higher f-stop number because the depth of field is much deeper. You're using manual focus, right? The next part of the equation that is camera settings is ISO, or sometimes called gain. Now you want to keep the ISO as low as possible. The higher it is, the more disgusting artifacts and digital noise will be introduced into your footage. When I'm setting up my camera, I first pick my frame rate, then I set my shutter speed to match using the 180-degree rule. Then I work on my exposure using the lowest ISO possible, and then changing my aperture to get the correct exposure. If you're in a low light situation, you'll probably max out your aperture and still be underexposed, in which case you'll have to raise the ISO, but that's the only time you should raise it. Alright, last but not least is white balance. Now, white balance is just adjusting to different colors of light so that what's supposed to be white in your footage appears white. Now, our eyes do this automatically, and cameras can too. The problem is that the camera will constantly adjust the white balance the whole time you're filming, and this leads to an undesirable look. In general, midday sun will call for a white balance of around 5600 Kelvin, and if you're indoors with artificial light, it's usually going to be around 3200 Kelvin. To set my white balance, I use an app on my phone that's really simple, and it only does one thing, and that is, you guessed it, show me the white balance I need to use. It's called Light Spectrum Pro, and I'll put a link to it in the description. So there you have it, my camera settings for filming hunts. As always, if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and if you have any questions, I'd love to talk to you about them in the comments.